Clint Eastwood was minding his own business, sipping his coffee outside a quiet diner, when a bloodied man stumbled onto the street. Moments later, two uniformed cops followed, not to help, but to finish the job. The crowd froze. No one stepped in. No one dared. But Clint? He set down his cup, adjusted his hat, and decided this wouldn't be their lucky day. What he did next exposed a deadly secret, shook the entire town, and brought a corrupt empire crashing down. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you stunned. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The sun hung high in the sky, merciless and unrelenting, casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Heat waves rippled off the road, distorting the quiet town like a mirage. Clint Eastwood sat outside a small diner, the brim of his hat shading his weathered face. A steaming cup of black coffee rested in his grip, its bitter aroma mixing with the faint scent of dust and fried bacon wafting from inside. He liked mornings like this, quiet, uncomplicated. But peace never lasted long in a town rotting from the inside. A gut-wrenching scream tore through the air, sharp enough to make the few people on the street flinch. Clint's fingers tensed around his coffee cup, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Then came the sound of shuffling footsteps. Staggering. Desperation. Clint turned his head just in time to see a man stumble into the street. He was a mess. His shirt, once white, was torn and stained red. His face was battered, one eye already swollen shut. He clutched his ribs, each breath a struggle, his steps unsteady as if he were running on pure willpower alone. But what made Clint's jaw tighten, what made the coffee in his cup suddenly taste like ashes, was the sight of two uniformed officers emerging from the alley behind him. They weren't chasing him. They weren't calling for an ambulance or shouting for backup. They were hunting him down like a wounded animal too stubborn to die. One of them, a broad-shouldered man with a thick mustache, smirked. "Told you to stay quiet," he muttered, rolling his shoulders like he was warming up for another round. Before the bloodied man could even react, the officer slammed a fist into his gut. A deep, ugly wheeze escaped the man's lips as he crumpled to the ground. He didn't even have the strength to fight back. He just lay there, trembling, hands still clutching his ribs. The other officer, young, eager, his badge still looking too new, chuckled under his breath. "Think he's learned his lesson yet?" The first cop wiped his knuckles on his pant leg. "Not sure. Maybe one more for good measure." Clint sighed, a long, tired sigh. He set his coffee down on the table, slow and deliberate, as if he already knew what came next. Because he did. His fingers reached for the edge of his coat, adjusting it as he pushed back his chair. The legs scraped against the concrete, a sound that made both officers pause. Clint rose to his full height, his shadow stretching long across the sun-baked street. "Well," he muttered, tilting his hat back just enough for them to see the sharp glint in his eyes. "Guess breakfast is over." The afternoon sun hung heavy in the sky, baking the asphalt, stretching shadows long across the dust-covered street. A light breeze rustled the edges of Clint's coat, but the heat didn't seem to touch him. His eyes, sharp as steel, locked onto the two officers standing over the battered man. "That's enough," he growled, his voice low but carrying the kind of weight that made men pause. The officers froze, their backs tensing as they turned toward the interruption. Clint took his time stepping off the diner's porch, his boots scuffing against the pavement. The entire town seemed to hold its breath. The younger cop, barely past his mid-20s, took one look at Clint and scoffed. His uniform was still crisp, his badge too polished, the arrogance of a man who thought the world bent in his favor. "Walk away, old man," he said, his smirk dripping with amusement. "You don't know what's going on here." Clint didn't flinch. He took another slow step forward, his shadow stretching like a warning between him and the two cops. "I know enough." The older officer, the one who had thrown the punch, studied Clint more carefully. His fingers twitched at his side. He wasn't laughing. A murmur swept through the small crowd that had started to gather. People peeked out from behind shop doors, some gripping their phones, recording. A woman near the curb whispered to her husband, Is that Clint Eastwood?" But Clint wasn't paying attention to them. His eyes flickered to the man on the ground. Blood pooled beneath his lip, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths. His fingers twitched weakly against the pavement. Then through cracked lips, he muttered, "They'll kill me if I talk." Clint's jaw tightened. He already knew the truth. This wasn't some random beatdown. This man wasn't just a nobody caught in the wrong place. He knew something, and these cops were making sure he stayed quiet. The younger officer sighed dramatically, shaking his head like Clint was nothing more than an annoyance. "Look, cowboy," he muttered, stepping forward. "We don't need some washed-up tough guy getting in the way." Clint remained still, unmoving, unshaken. That's when the older officer, his patience clearly spent, gritted his teeth and reached for his baton. "I said walk away!" Clint's fingers curled slightly at his sides, his stance shifting just enough. The town had gone silent. The moment was coming. And Clint? He was ready for it. The older officer barely had time to lift his baton before Clint's hand shot out, gripping his wrist like a steel vise. The movement was fast, controlled, effortless. For a moment, the officer's face twisted in shock. He tried to yank his arm free, but Clint's grip didn't budge. The leather of his glove creaked as he squeezed just a little harder. Not enough to break anything, but enough to make his point clear. The crowd gasped. Someone muttered, "Did you see that?" Phones were raised, recording every second of the standoff. In one swift motion, Clint twisted the officer's wrist just enough to make him drop the baton. It clattered against the pavement, the sound ringing loud in the thick silence. The younger cop took a hesitant step back. His cocky smirk had vanished, replaced by something else. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Clint finally released the older officer's wrist, letting him stumble back a step. The man cradled his hand, jaw clenched, eyes burning with humiliation. "Who the hell do you think you are?" the officer snarled. Clint tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. Then with the smallest smirk, he said, "I'm the guy who just saved you from making a big mistake." The younger officer's gaze darted between Clint and his partner. His fingers twitched near his holster, but he didn't draw. Not with dozens of people watching. Then, in a low whisper, meant only for his partner's ears, he said, "We need to call the chief." That got Clint's attention. His smirk faded, his expression turning cold. The chief. He had no doubt that whoever this man was, he was at the center of something rotten. The older officer, still seething from the humiliation, spit on the ground near Clint's feet before turning sharply on his heel. "Let's go." The younger cop hesitated for half a second longer, then followed. They retreated down the street, but not before one of them muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Clint to hear, "This isn't over." Clint exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders as he watched them disappear around the corner. He already knew that. This was just the beginning. The street was still buzzing from the confrontation. Whispers rippled through the crowd, but no one dared step forward. The two officers had left, but their shadows still lingered, a silent promise that trouble wasn't far behind. Clint exhaled slowly, then turned his gaze toward the man on the ground. His breath came in ragged gasps, his body trembling from exhaustion and pain. Blood stained his shirt, and sweat clung to his forehead. Clint crouched beside him, his voice calm but firm. "Tell me, son, what exactly did you see?" The man winced, sucking in a sharp breath. For a moment, Clint thought he might pass out, but then, with great effort, he forced his eyes open, looking at Clint like a man who knew he had nothing left to lose. "They work for the chief," he whispered, "and he's hiding something big." Clint's expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened. The chief, the way the officers had reacted when they mentioned him, the way the younger cop's smirk had vanished, it all made sense now. They weren't just random corrupt cops roughing up a nobody. They were following orders, and orders always led back to someone higher up. Clint leaned in slightly, his voice dropping lower. "What's the chief's name?" The man stiffened. His breathing turned even more erratic, and his eyes darted around like he expected someone to jump out of the shadows. "If I say it," he rasped, barely above a whisper, "I'm dead." Clint studied him. Fear ran deep in this town, deeper than he had realized. But fear wouldn't get them anywhere. "You're already half dead," Clint muttered, gripping the man's arm and pulling him up just enough so he could look him in the eye. "Might as well make it count." The man swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. His lips trembled as if the name itself was poison. He took a breath. "His name is Screech!" A loud screech of tires cut through the air like a blade. Clint's head snapped up just in time to see a black SUV come to a violent stop at the curb. The engine growled, the vehicle's tinted windows reflecting the harsh sunlight. The crowd immediately stepped back, murmurs of unease spreading like wildfire. Then, the door swung open, and from the darkness of the SUV, a figure stepped out, Clint didn't move. He just adjusted his hat, his fingers itching for the holster at his side. Because whatever was about to happen next, he knew one thing for sure. This just got a hell of a lot more interesting. The SUV door swung open with a heavy thud, and a polished black boot stepped onto the hot pavement. The murmurs in the crowd died instantly, replaced by a tense, expectant silence. Then from the shadows of the vehicle he emerged, tall, broad-shouldered. His police uniform was impeccably pressed, the gold insignia on his chest gleaming under the unforgiving sun. Dwayne Calloway, the chief of police. His very presence shifted the air, a suffocating weight pressing down on the street. The moment the officers saw him, they snapped to attention like soldiers in the presence of a general. Spines straight, hands still, eyes forward. This wasn't just a man with power. This was a man who ruled by fear. Calloway took a slow step forward, his gaze sweeping over the scene. His eyes, dark and unreadable, landed on Clint. And then he smirked. "You making trouble in my town, cowboy?" His voice was smooth, practiced, the kind of tone used to make men underestimate him. Clint didn't flinch. He adjusted his hat slightly, his eyes never leaving Calloway's. "Just cleaning up someone else's mess." Calloway let out a slow chuckle, shaking his head as if amused. But his eyes told a different story. Then, without missing a beat, he turned his attention to the bloodied man still on the ground. With a deliberate slowness, he crouched. The injured man tensed, his breath hitching, his fingers digging into the cracked pavement as if trying to disappear into the ground. Calloway leaned in close, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You should keep your mouth shut." The man shivered. His swollen eye darted to Clint, pleading without words. Clint had seen fear before. Real fear. The kind that wrapped around a man's throat and squeezed until there was no way out. And he had never been the type to stand back and let it happen. Slowly, Clint stepped forward, placing himself between them. Calloway straightened, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly as Clint blocked his path. "That's not happening," Clint said, his voice steady as stone. A beat of silence. The tension crackled like a slow-burning fuse. The entire town watched, waiting, because whatever happened next, there was no turning back now. Chief Calloway's smirk remained fixed, his confidence unwavering as if he had already played this game 100 times and knew exactly how it would end. His eyes flickered with amusement, but there was something darker beneath it, something calculated. "All right, Eastwood," he said smoothly, tucking his thumbs into his belt. "Let's talk." He motioned toward a nearby building, a small, dimly lit bar across the street. It looked as though it had seen better days. The wooden sign above the door faded and barely legible. A couple of men sitting outside, nursing half-finished beers, caught sight of Calloway and immediately scattered, leaving behind their drinks as if they had no intention of being caught anywhere near what was about to happen. Clint didn't move at first. His gaze swept over the scene, the officers standing rigidly behind Calloway, waiting for orders, their hands twitching near their holsters. The injured man behind him let out a shaky breath, but his expression was clear. He was counting on Clint to finish what had started. Adjusting his coat, Clint exhaled through his nose and stepped forward, following the chief through the doorway. Inside, the bar was exactly what Clint expected. Dim, quiet, and intentionally empty. The air was heavy with the scent of old cigarette smoke and spilled whiskey that had long since soaked into the floorboard. The place had been cleared out before their arrival, leaving only dust-covered tables and the low hum of a flickering neon sign. Calloway walked behind the counter, reaching for a bottle of amber-colored liquor. He poured 2 glasses, sliding one across the bar toward Clint before taking a slow sip of his own. The way he did it, calm, confident, unaffected, made it clear that he wasn't worried. "You should walk away from this one," Calloway said, swirling the glass in his hand before setting it down with a soft clink against the wooden bar top. His voice was steady, controlled, the voice of a man used to getting what he wanted. Clint didn't touch the drink. He remained still, his expression unreadable, his hands resting lightly on the bar. But his body was tense beneath the surface. He had dealt with men like Calloway before, men who used power as a shield, who mistook control for invincibility. "And if I don't?" Clint finally asked, his voice carrying no hint of hesitation. Calloway let out a slow exhale, shaking his head slightly, as if Clint were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. "Accidents happen," the chief replied, his tone casual but laced with unmistakable warning. A heavy silence followed. The meaning behind his words was clear. Clint leaned forward slightly, His gaze locked onto Calloway's, never wavering. He wasn't here to be intimidated. You're gonna wish they didn't. For the first time, something flickered in Calloway's eyes. Annoyance? Amusement? Maybe both. Either way, the confidence in his posture never faded. Slowly, he pulled out his phone and tapped the screen with deliberate precision. If you won't back off, he murmured, his tone lower now, more controlled, maybe I'll handle this my way. A faint, distant click sounded through the speaker, followed by the low hum of a call connecting. Outside, the unmistakable roar of an engine came to life, its deep growl cutting through the silence like a warning. And just like that, Clint knew the real fight had just begun. Clint's phone vibrated against the wooden bar, the faint buzzing cutting through the tension in the room. One new message. He slid his phone from his pocket and glanced at the screen. The number was unknown. No name, no history. Just a single line of text staring back at him. Check the files. Clint's eyes flicked up, meeting Calloway's amused smirk. The chief took another slow sip of his drink, watching Clint like a man who thought he had already won. Clint wasn't about to let him see any reaction. Mind if I step outside? Clint asked, his tone casual, almost bored. Calloway gestured toward the door, his smirk widening. Be my guest. Clint didn't wait. He pushed away from the bar, stepping out into the fading sunlight. The heat had started to settle, the sky streaked with deep orange and purple. Across the street, a few bystanders still lingered, whispering, glancing toward the bar, waiting to see what would happen next. Leaning against a post, Clint opened the message, a file attachment. He clicked it. Instantly, his screen flooded with scanned police records, case files, mugshots, names and faces of people who had disappeared. Clint scrolled through them, his gut tightening. Every case had been quietly dismissed, reports stamped with a familiar signature, Chief Dwayne Calloway. Clint exhaled through his nose, his grip on the phone tightening. He had suspected the corruption ran deep, but this was proof. Names, dates, locations. People erased from existence with the stroke of a pen. A low mutter escaped him. Now we're getting somewhere. Before he could scroll any further, his phone buzzed again. Another message, same unknown number. If you want proof, meet me in 20 minutes. Clint's eyes narrowed. He glanced toward the bar, knowing Calloway was inside, probably thinking he still controlled the game. But now Clint had leverage. Tucking his phone back into his pocket, he adjusted his hat, stepping off the porch. It was time to see just how deep this rabbit hole went. The parking lot was empty, save for a few flickering streetlights that barely held back the creeping darkness. The air smelled of old asphalt and distant rain, the kind of night where the world felt on edge, like something was about to happen. Clint pulled his truck into a shadowed corner and killed the engine. Across the lot, a lone figure stood near an abandoned gas station, shifting nervously from foot to foot. The man kept glancing over his shoulder, his paranoia almost palpable. Clint stepped out, boots crunching softly against the gravel as he made his way over. You the one who sent the message? Clint asked, his voice low but firm. The man flinched slightly at Clint's presence, but gave a small nod. He was younger than Clint expected, mid-30s, scruffy, with dark circles under his eyes. The look of someone who hadn't slept right in a long time. You have no idea what you're getting into, the man whispered, his voice barely above the wind. Clint tilted his head slightly. Try me. The informant swallowed hard, then pulled a crumpled folder from inside his jacket. He handed it over quickly, like he was afraid to hold on to it any longer than necessary. Clint opened it. More names, more faces, more people who had vanished without a trace. But these files were different from the ones on his phone. These weren't just arrests. These were death certificates. He buries people who cross him, the informant said, his voice hoarse. Not metaphorically, literally. Clint's grip on the folder tightened. He had figured Calloway was dirty, but this was murder. You got locations? Clint asked, flipping through the pages. The man hesitated. I've heard rumors. An old construction site outside town, supposed to be abandoned, but people go in and don't come out. He shook his head. If the chief finds out I told you this, he won't, Clint cut in. He closed the folder and tucked it under his arm. Not anymore. The informant exhaled shakily, running a hand through his hair, relief and fear battling in his expression. Then, headlights cut through the darkness. A black car, idling just at the edge of the lot, its engine humming low, watching. The informant's eyes went wide with terror. You were followed, he whispered. Clint didn't turn around immediately. He adjusted his hat, his other hand drifting just slightly toward his coat, toward the holster underneath. Yeah, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. Figured as much. The police station was quieter than usual. Too quiet. Clint stepped through the glass doors, his boots echoing against the polished tile. Officers milled about, but their conversations were hushed, their glances nervous. They knew why he was here. At the far end of the room, behind a large wooden desk, Chief Dwayne Calloway sat in his chair waiting, his lips curled into a slow smirk as Clint approached, his posture relaxed, one hand lazily resting on the armrest. But his eyes, cold, calculating, watched Clint like a snake waiting to strike. Clint stopped in front of the desk, his stance solid, unshaken. "We need to talk," Clint said. Calloway chuckled, leaning back slightly. "Do we?" Clint didn't bother answering. Instead, he reached into his coat and dropped the folder onto the desk. The files spread open, revealing pages upon pages of missing persons reports, falsified arrest records, and, worse, death certificates. The smirk on Calloway's face barely faltered. He let out a slow, deliberate breath as he picked up one of the papers, flipping it between his fingers. "And?" he asked, feigning boredom. "This proves nothing." Clint tilted his head. "That's funny," he said, his voice calm, "because it looks a hell of a lot like a confession waiting to happen." Calloway laughed, a deep, rumbling sound that spread through the room like a slow-moving toxin. A few officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some glancing toward the exits. "Eastwood," Calloway said, shaking his head as if scolding a child. This won't be enough to stop me." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You think a few papers mean anything? You think anybody cares?" Clint studied him, his expression unreadable. "Then," he smirked. "I know," he admitted. "That's why I brought a little something extra." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a USB drive. Calloway's smirk vanished. Clint rolled the drive between his fingers, then set it down beside the files. "Live audio recordings," he said casually, "of you, making threats, ordering arrests, covering up bodies." The room seemed to shrink. For the first time, Calloway's confidence wavered. His fingers twitched against the desk. His eyes darted to the officers around them, some of whom had stopped moving altogether, their attention now fully locked on the exchange. Clint leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "You were saying—" The chief's jaw clenched. Checkmate. The smirk on Chief Calloway's face faltered, the confidence he had carried for years now hanging by a fragile thread. His fingers twitched against the desk as the sound of his own voice echoed through the room, played aloud for everyone to hear. The television screens mounted around the station displayed the live news broadcasts, the anchors speaking in urgent, serious tones. "Breaking news. A shocking audio leak has just exposed widespread police corruption. The tapes, obtained from an anonymous whistleblower, allegedly reveal Police Chief Dwayne Calloway ordering illegal arrests and orchestrating the cover-up of multiple disappearances." Then, his voice filled the room. "Take care of him. I don't care how. Make him disappear. If anyone asks, the reports are already handled. No body, no case. Nobody's going to question it. We run this town." The weight of those words settled over the officers in the station like a crushing force. Some stiffened. Others exchanged uneasy glances. A few took small, instinctive steps away from their chief, as if putting distance between themselves and a sinking ship. For the first time, Calloway looked around the room and saw the loyalty he had depended on for years starting to unravel. He shot to his feet, knocking over the glass of whiskey on his desk. The amber liquid spilled across the polished wood, soaking into the scattered files Clint had placed in front of him. "Turn that off!" Calloway's voice was sharp, filled with the same commanding authority he had always used to control those around him. But nobody moved. The air was thick with hesitation, the unspoken question hanging in the silence. Who still stood with him now? Then, the front doors of the station burst open. A wave of reporters flooded the lobby, their cameras flashing in rapid succession, microphones thrust forward as voices clashed in a chaotic storm. "Chief Calloway, do you deny these allegations? Did you personally order unlawful arrests? Where are the missing people?" The questions hit like bullets, but Calloway remained frozen, his face locked in a tight, furious expression. His gaze snapped back to Clint, burning with hatred. "You son of a—" Clint lifted a hand slightly, his expression calm, unreadable. "I'd choose your next words carefully," he said, his voice measured, steady. Might be the last time anyone listens to you." Before Calloway could respond, the doors opened again. This time it wasn't reporters. It was state officials. A tall man in a dark suit stepped forward, flashing his badge for all to see. His voice was clipped, professional, leaving no room for argument. "Dwayne Calloway, you are under arrest for corruption, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit unlawful detainment." The tension in the room shifted. The officers, men who had once stood at Calloway's side without question, did nothing. No one rushed to his defense. No one moved to stop what was happening. For the first time in his career, he stood alone. A grim silence fell as the state official motioned to the officers near the door. Calloway's own men hesitated, then stepped forward, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. His jaw tightened as his hands were yanked behind his back, metal snapping around his wrists. As they began to lead him away, he turned his head, locking eyes with Clint one final time. His voice was lower now, almost a whisper, but every word was laced with venom. "This isn't over." The tension that had suffocated the town for years finally began to lift. For the first time in a long while, people walked through the streets without fear. There was a change in the air. Not just relief, but something deeper: vindication. Clint stood on the steps of the police station, his hat tilted slightly forward as he watched the aftermath unfold. The once powerful Chief Calloway had been hauled away in a squad car, his final glare still lingering in Clint's mind like a bad aftertaste. But it didn't matter anymore. The evidence was everywhere. His empire of corruption had collapsed. The news had spread far beyond the borders of this town. Every major network was running the story. Reports detailing years of illegal arrests, falsified documents, and disappearances were being exposed nationwide. The entire state was watching. Across the street, a small crowd had gathered around a television in a shop window, the volume turned up high. A well-dressed anchor spoke in urgent tones, the scrolling news ticker at the bottom, flashing words like, "Police chief arrested in widespread corruption scandal. Victims come forward as investigation expands." Clint took in the scene with quiet satisfaction. The town wasn't just watching, they were part of this. They had seen the truth unfold in real time, and now they knew they didn't have to be afraid anymore. The sound of approaching footsteps made Clint turn slightly. The informant, the man who had risked his life to leak the files, stepped up beside him. He looked different now, not just tired but lighter. "They're listening," the informant said, almost in disbelief. He gestured toward the crowd, toward the reporters, toward the officers who were now scrambling to clean up the mess they had once ignored. "They are," Clint replied. He studied the man for a moment. "And now, they'll listen to you." The informant swallowed, nodding. "I'm ready." He stepped forward toward the microphones, his voice steady as he began to testify. The reporters closed in, their cameras flashing wildly. Questions flew in from every direction, some aimed at the informant, others at the officials who had taken over the police department. Then one of the reporters turned toward Clint. "Eastwood," she called, pushing a microphone toward him. "Why'd you do it?" Clint adjusted his hat, a small, knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "Somebody had to," he said. The cameras flashed brighter, capturing the moment. But Clint? He had already turned away. Because for him, this job was done. The sun hung low in the sky, bleeding shades of gold and crimson across the horizon. The air was warm, carrying the distant hum of a town slowly coming back to life. For the first time in years, there was no shadow of fear hanging over it. Clint stepped out of the police station, the weight of the past few days finally settling in his bones. He adjusted his hat, letting the brim shield his eyes from the last remnants of daylight. Behind him, the station bustled with activity, officers scrambling to reorganize, reporters shouting questions at officials, the final echoes of a regime that had finally collapsed. He didn't look back. Across the street, leaning against the side of an old brick building, stood the man Clint had pulled from the pavement just days before. The bruises on his face were still deep, but his posture was different now, less afraid, more grounded. Their eyes met. The man pushed off the wall and walked toward Clint, his steps slower than before, but steady. He didn't say much. He didn't have to. Instead, he extended a hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough but sincere. Clint glanced down at the outstretched hand for a moment before taking it in a firm shake. There was nothing dramatic about it, no grand gesture, just understanding. He let go and tipped his hat slightly. "Stay safe, kid." The man gave a small nod before stepping back, watching as Clint turned toward the open road. The town was different now. Calloway was gone. The people had seen the truth, but Clint knew how this worked. This was one battle. There would be others. And then his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, the glow of the screen casting a faint light over his face as he read the message. Another case. You in? A slow smirk tugged at Clint's lips. Without hesitation, he slipped the phone back into his pocket, adjusted his coat, and kept walking, disappearing into the fading light. Because for Clint Eastwood, there was always another fight.